Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Haley Davis, Communications Assistant for Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Charlotte Craig about urban ecology, specifically looking at how climate change will be affecting bee populations in urban areas. Globally, understanding the rights of nature is evolving. Here at Sierra Club Canada, we are rooted in protecting our biodiversity in the face of climate change. It is becoming increasingly essential to understand that all ecosystems on our planet are deeply intertwined. By doing podcasts focusing on pollinators and the impacts of climate change, we want to emphasize the importance of the rights of nature and protecting our ecosystems. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular new updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. The podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 93 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us. Hi, Charlotte. Firstly, welcome to the Environment in Canada podcast. It's an honor to have you speaking with us today. So we have a wide range of listeners tuning in here. So firstly, we'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and your research. Like, where did you grow up, go to school? What is urban ecology? And what made you interested in bees and pursue a bee master's research?
Great. So I'm really happy to be here and get a chance to speak to you all. In terms of my background, I grew up mostly on the east coast of Canada, but I did move to the Caribbean when I was young and then to Florida for boarding school a little bit later on. I then came to Toronto for university. I went to the University of Toronto. I did my undergrad there, focusing on environmental biology, forestry science, and environmental studies. I then continued at U of T and I completed my master's in ecology and evolutionary biology. In terms of my research, throughout my undergrad, I really focused on community ecology and how the world works together to make the ecosystems that we have today. My first research job was with the university in the Malcolm Forestry Lab. And in that research, we looked at how logging impacted beetle populations in Algonquin Park in Halliburton Forest Reserve. And from there, I really grew a love for research surrounding anthropogenic influences on communities as a whole. And also learning more about field work was always a really great opportunity. In my master's, I looked at similar themes, so anthropogenic influences on communities again. When I spoke to Professor McIver, my master's thesis supervisor, I realized that his lab was doing a lot of really cool work on community ecology, really on the cutting edge of innovative research. So it seemed like a really easy fit for me to join the lab. The lab also focused on urban ecology, which, to answer your question, is the study of ecological systems in urban spaces, which I think is an incredibly underserved area of research and is an area that people don't spend as much time because it's not as flashy. There's not as many researchers working in the space. So overall, just an environmentalist from the beginning and getting the chance to work on communities and indicator species such as bees and beetles has really been my passion.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for giving us a little bit of insight into that. How would you think working with beetle populations and versus bee populations, do you think they're pretty similar, or how would you say they kind of compare to each other?
I think that a lot of people would think that they're so similar. I think a lot of people view the study of insects as a one and done kind of space, but it's really one of the most diverse areas of research. So beetles are, well, to begin, just the research of them is incredibly different. When I was working in Algonquin Park, we did a lot of flight intercept traps where beetles actually just run into a pane of glass and then fall into a bucket. Okay. And you are able to leave them for a certain amount of time and then go collect them. Whereas with bees, you actually have to go out and use an insect vacuum and get them into little vials so that they can be identified later. Because there's so many different kinds of both of them, it's actually really difficult to do non-invasive trapping methods.
Right.
So yeah, there's a big difference between all of them. I think they're both indicator species, so they show what's happening in their community really effectively. So there are a lot of similarities, especially in how diverse they are. So beetle populations and bee populations within Canada are much more diverse than anyone would know. We have over 400 species of bees in Ontario alone.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. You wouldn't recognize all of them.
That's crazy. Yeah, I feel like in school we learn about, I took a honeybee biology class and we learn about the honeybee and like a few other types of bees, but not the 400 species.
Yeah, the honeybees definitely dominate the airwaves, but native bees play such an important unsung role. They aren't as glamorous. I mean, you don't get to eat anything they make, but they play a huge role. And beetles, no one really enjoys them. No one wants them in their house, but they're so diverse and so important to our ecosystems and part of our food chains.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, moving on to the next question. So, how do you think your research has filled a gap in knowledge of current studies so far? So, I guess specifically your master's research.
Yeah, so my research is still in the process of being published. So I'm waiting for the opportunity for it to really start being influenced on future research outside of my lab. But I think that when it does become more widely available, I'll be able to inform a lot of different areas of research. Most prevalent would be the in situ manipulation of experiments and experimental approaches to emulate climate change warming in external in situ experiments. So my research took an incredible amount of trial and error. And I think that people who are looking to emulate climate change scenarios will be able to benefit from my research and not have to do quite as much failure to get to their success.
Right.
I also think that the application of different theses around temperature mitigation and management in smaller animals will also benefit those working in insects and ectotherms. So temperature management is examined in a lot of larger species, and it's a lot easier to see, but these theories haven't been tested on our smaller, less prominently studied species. So I think that the application of that work will open up a whole new avenue of research. Specifically for the Bogart effect would be a really great area for them to learn more.
Okay. Do you want
Also,
to explain a little bit about the Bogart effect?
yeah, of course. So the Bogart effect is the idea that animals are maintaining their thermal optimum by making changes in their short-term processes, such as phenonic plasticity, and long-term processes such as evolutionary adaptation. So they can they can manage their temperature internally by changing the behavior that they do instantly, and then also evolving to be more tolerant of temperature.
Okay, which is yeah, very essential in the next forthcoming years based on all the warming we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Bogart effect only is so applicable in a place that's changing so rapidly, such as our urban centers, because, evolutionary adaptation can't move as quickly as climate change is moving in.
Right. Yeah, right. That makes sense. So yeah, moving on, and we kind of touched on that, but moving on to the next question. So based on your research, how have bees been shown to manage temperature changes and maintain their thermal optimum? Yeah, just kind of explaining a bit more about that Bogart effect and
Yeah, definitely. So just to give a little bit of background, so bees are ectothermic, meaning that they don't have any ways of internally managing their body temperatures like us as humans do. So instead of internal methods, they actually manage their temperature through different behaviors. So we were talking a little about honeybees earlier, and they're one of the most studied groups of bees due to their implication for human benefit. But honeybees have a lot of examples of maintaining their temperature through different activities. So, for example, honeybees have conducted group movements within their hives. So they actually shiver by contracting their flight muscles to create heat around the queen. And they're also known to sun themselves on rocks on cool mornings to warm themselves up in order to get to that thermal optimum range that they best perform in. Another one that I find very interesting, which might not be as interesting to those who haven't spent as much time around bees, is that honeybees, and actually are known to regurgitate honey onto their face to create an evaporative cooling effect on themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like their own personalized version of sweating. Maybe
Nice.
a little bit grosser than ours, but very effective.
Okay.
Um, Smaller native bees also have their methods of cooling themselves. So they're known to take cooling flights, which are briefer and more frequent flights that cool themselves down through the addition of airflow. And other pollinators also have this kind of need to maintain their temperatures to do the necessary actions that they have every day. So pollinating wasps are also impacted by temperature as they're also ectothermic. So pollinating wasps actually have been shown by many studies to have a significantly shorter lifespan and fly less when they're exposed to high temperatures. And pollinating flies also need their temperature needs met, and they actually have been known to spend long periods of time on warmer flowers when the air is cold, and vice versa when they go to colder flowers when the air is hot.
Okay.
And this is all really important. As much as it is fun facts about bees and other pollinators, it's really important because all of these methods of temperature control really impacts how and when bees and other pollinators can forage and fly, which in turn impacts pollination services to plants, which is so necessary not only for humans, but animals as well.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, that's awesome. That's very interesting. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I remember even from my class, it felt like bees are just there's just such an interesting organism. It kind of felt like I was in a little fairy tale, like within the bee movie or something, like just learning about their dances and all the things they can do. Like I don't know if this is correct, but do they also do fanning to manage temperature changes, or is that maybe something else?
I'm not sure. I'm sure honeybees have some kind of activity that allows them to fan the hive when they need to cool down. I'm not sure what the process would be called, but one other thing that I would like to mention is that I mentioned a bunch of different processes for different groups of pollinators, but also within the pollinators, there's also a huge difference in climate sensitivity based off of taxonomic differences, as well as ecological traits such as sociality, body size, or specialized foraging behaviors.
Okay.
So, a lot of studies have shown that social bees are actually more heat tolerant than solitary bees, suggesting that their life history can predict climate sensitivity. And it's also well known that smaller bees are differently impacted by changes in temperature than their larger counterparts. And, there's a lot of studies that focus a lot on that thermal range, and it's just incredibly variant depending on the species, even if they reside in the same ecosystem.
Right. Okay. And yeah, just to kind of jump in, do you mind, just for our listeners, do you want to explain a little bit the difference between social bees and solitary bees?
Yeah, definitely. So again, a lot of us picture a honeybee and its hive when we think of a bee, and we think of this kind of hive mind, this large group of organisms that work together and they all have dedicated roles, but that's actually not the case for most of our bees. Most of our bees outside of a handful, especially within Canada, are actually solitary bees. So without the inclusion of their mating season, they actually live primarily socially. So they forage for themselves, they create homes for themselves. Some bees bury themselves in tunnels underground. Some go and they nest in holes in trees. And while occasionally we can see bees of the same type residing in the same area just due to the validity and the accessibility of the area itself, they actually do very little interacting with themselves besides mating. And then yeah, so there's a big difference between some of them. So I think that it's just really interesting how different their lives can be, and how we assume that they're all buddies and friends with each other with a central home to all hang out.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like growing up, that's definitely what we've learned is that they like fly together, they live together, just kind of do everything. But you're saying they're a little more like solitary than we think.
Yeah, the majority of bees are absolutely solitary, and they have so many protection mechanisms to keep themselves safe. A lot of bees use different materials to kind of barricade their eggs into their hidey spots. So whether that be in a tree or in a dugout tunnel, they use pieces of leaves or pieces of petals to barricade their fertilized eggs so that they're protected once they have died and the season continues on, and waiting for those bees to hatch in the coming year.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, so they do a lot of stuff, and it's incredibly important to recognize these habitats as integral to bee populations. So, keeping the leaves on the ground in the fall, also leaving open patches of not tightly packed soil for those bees that do tunnel, and then also having opportunities in trees for bees to get into those nooks and crannies to breed.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, that's good to know. I feel like, yeah, we're always taught just, plant flowers that are good pollinators for bees. But yeah, it sounds like you have some other tips and tricks that we can do to save the bees.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so moving on to the next question. What are the main effects warming temperatures and climatic changes have had on bee pollination events? And why do you think, just a little bit, I was looking at some of your results from your research, you kind of explained that larger bodied bees, such as carpenter bees, were able to tolerate warmer flowers. So why do you think that's the case?
Yeah. So to address your first question, so what are the main effects of warming temperature and climatic changes on bee pollination events? So in my study, we tested the hypothesis that higher floral temperature is negatively correlated with floral visitor abundance. So as temperature goes up, there's going to be less bees. And this is due to the Bogart effect that we talked a little about earlier, and the need to stay within that thermal optimum. And my research found that during the summer season, when bees are most likely to be exposed to extreme heat events outside of their thermal range, they did in fact choose to avoid hotter foraging areas. Um, but in less extreme times, like the spring and the fall, these trends were not as consistent, most likely due to the lack of extremes that bees experienced. So in the spring and fall, when they weren't as pressured, they were more likely to evenly choose the flowers. And then in the summer, when there were extreme heat events, they really did rely on those cooler flowers to forage. Yeah, and it's really complicated just because the experiment that we did had a lot to do with emulating even more extreme temperatures. So even with the extreme temperature events that we experienced during the summer in which I conducted my master's, we actually had heaters that emulated an even more extreme scenario of climate change increase. So about a 2.1% temperature increase in our urban centers is what we emulated.
Okay.
And yeah, so we saw a more extreme response, and that makes sense because bees are quite adaptive. They're not going to, there is a lot of variation, especially within our urban spaces of temperature. The temperature difference between green spaces and the gray industry spaces is a lot bigger than a lot of people expect. So they do have some plasticity in their ability to forage.
Okay. Okay, cool. So yeah, do you think, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but do you think that certain bee populations, like the smaller bodied bees, will be affected more negatively with climate change then and continued like increased anthropogenic sources?
Yeah, based on my research and the study by others, it definitely is likely that smaller bodied bees are going to be more impacted by temperature change. So, and has to do a lot with different aspects, again, due to taxonomic differences, sociality, and things like that. But the thing that we can really attribute to in terms of size is that larger bees have a larger surface area to volume ratio, which limits water loss. So they aren't as impacted as quickly as smaller bees, so they can be better adapted to change their activities to mitigate that water loss, whereas smaller bees are at higher risk.
Okay, that makes sense. And just on another note, when they are foraging, do they have certain like receptors on them that will like they can how do they detect basically the temperature of the flower? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so it's still left to be researched much more extensively how they can perceive the temperature of the flowers and themselves, but it's somewhat similar to other insects. So they're able to just have that in their system to let them know that it's hotter or colder. I'm not quite sure what the actual taxonomic determinant is, but they are known to be able to choose based off of different temperatures.
Okay.
They also, if you look at a picture of a flower in a thermal camera, there's actually a lot of flowers that use different thermal and color patterns to draw pollinators into the center where the pollen and the nectar are. So having that indication of temperature is actually beneficial to them as they look to forage and find those areas of optimal of nectar.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, and I guess just kind of a little bit more about your research, but like when you were looking at the different flowers, did you find that the actual flower itself, like certain species would tolerate the warmer temperatures better? Or did you not really, was that not really something you like paid too much attention to during your study?
Yeah, during our study, we did bring in our own flowers. So we brought in 3 different species dependent on the season. And what we did was we actually consistently tried to keep them as healthy as possible to entice further visitation. So they were all given water and they were all given an opportunity to not be in direct sunlight so they wouldn't completely dry out and die. So we didn't really look at the impact of temperature on the plants themselves. But a lot of studies do look into how temperature impacts plant growth and development and pollination subsequently. And it's known that as temperature increase, nectar is actually going to increasingly evaporate, which will be much more difficult for bees and other pollinators to detect it.
Okay.
And this is something that dependent on a lot of things in the flower. So the shape of the flower, the height, the number of blooms, the color is all going to really impact how flowers respond in the heat, and then also how pollinators perceive them as they change in the heat.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, when you were doing the studies, did you find that like because temperature was your controls and I noticed you used was it infrared light, I think?
We
Um,
just used a heater, yeah.
oh, just a heater. Okay. Did you find like it was hard to manage with like other abiotic factors like wind or rain? Did you find it hard to kind of maintain that, or how did you guys deal with that?
Yeah, it, as most field experiments, was incredibly difficult to manage all of those impacts.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we did try to mitigate the impact or at least compensate for changes in abiotic factors was we took just a plethora of temperature measurements. So we took a consistent at a 1 minute interval for each and every plant. We took a like a air temperature measurement of the plant surrounding temperature. And we also had a thermal gun that we took a picture of every single flower and traced out all of the flowers on each plant to get their surface temperature for each trial. And we also had temperature measurements as control throughout the study area so that we were able to compare and see how our manipulation was changing as we look to, see like have that 2-degree increase in our flowers.
Okay. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next question. In general, how do you foresee warming temperatures and climatic changes to continue to affect bee populations and foraging patterns in urban areas? I know we briefly touched on that, but yeah, what do you think are the most
Mhm.
important things we can do in order to minimize any negative impacts? Like what can we as the public do?
Yeah. So how do I foresee the warming temperatures and climatic changes and their effect on bee populations? So as temperature increases due to the synergistic effects of climate change and the urban heat island effect, bees are going to increasingly struggle to do their necessary functions. The increased heat is going to act as a filter for our bee species in Canada. And out of the over 400 bees within, our rural Ontario spaces, for example, many could be extirpated from our communities and leaving us without the necessary pollinators, which has a huge impact for humans and animals alike. Um, and I think that beyond the need for systematic changes to limit the consistent degradation of our ecosystems, that is in turn resulting in climate change and among other many big issues, there are small scale things that we can do to support our pollinators. So my research specifically highlighted the importance of high floral density. So high floral density seems to help mitigate the impact of extreme temperatures on bees. So just having increasing access to blooms for them to feed on, so that as they go through, they're able to select blooms that serve them and their thermal needs rather than being isolated to flowers that they have to go out of that thermal range for them to feed on is really important.
Okay.
And then one of the biggest things overall is just to provide more green space. So green spaces provide cooling effects in comparison to the great infrastructure counterparts. And this is beneficial not only to our bees, but also to humans. And it's shown time and time again that green spaces have physiological benefits for humans and also mental benefits for us, as it improves our mental health to be in these green spaces.
Right.
And yeah, we're all going to need the cooling effects of green spaces, so we might as well amp them up.
Yeah. And I was just going to jump in just because you mentioned I guess it's kind of relevant, but the urban heat island effect, and just so for people who don't really know what that is, yeah, correct me if I'm mistaken, but it's when it's just kind of in more urban areas, we see hotter temperatures as opposed to like more forested spaces, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then
And it's really something that's more seen in the night. So urban centers retain additional heat in comparison to our green spaces.
right. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, like even with kind of incorporating, yeah, more forested spaces into urban areas, that'll, yeah, not only affect, like positively affect our bee populations, but also reduce the urban heat island effect. So it also cool off the urban areas, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Do you have any other kind of important things that we as the public should know in order to minimize any negative impacts?
I think that just, yeah, making availability for green spaces and floral resources for bees is really important. And that can be as small as including access to spaces in your backyard or advocating for the addition of green roofs in your condo community if you're more in an urban space. There's lots of resources online that talk about bee hotels, and you can obviously get into those kinds of resources. But again, as I mentioned earlier, really just maintaining those natural spaces for bees to thrive in. So, arid soil, trees, and bushes for them to continue their way of life is incredibly important.
Okay, awesome. That's great to know. Thank you, Charlotte.
Yep.
And then on another note, so you worked for many different environmental organizations and have a lot of experience in environmental communication. So what do you think are some key differences and key commonalities in how environmental protection is portrayed to the public? In your opinion, is there any area that environmental advocacy organizations need to focus more on, or that they're lacking, or what should what should be the focus in your opinion?
Yeah, so I have done a lot of environmental communication as well as working on the science side, because I really do believe that science without accessible communication lacks a lot of purpose. Science for the purpose of science isn't going to create change, and it's going to create some kind of barrier between people and learning about the systems that work around them. So I think that it's incredibly important, and it is done in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of differences based off of the organization and context, but there are quite a few commonalities. So in terms of differences, beyond, the typical subject matter and area of focus that each organization is going to hold within their community, one big thing that I see is the messaging tone. So a lot of organizations vary their tone of messaging. So, they could have an alarmist tone or an optimistic tone. And that just has a lot to do with the subject matter and the target audience that they are looking to engage with. So, things like demographics, interests, and values are all going to impact how that messaging is portrayed to the public. I see a lot of messaging aimed at young adults that focus on the impacts of the climate change for future generations, as you see yourself in that information. And then there's other forms of communication to organizations such as business that really emphasizes the economic benefits of sustainability and kind of put that shiny look on the sustainability aspect. So there's just a lot of variance in how this information is communicated to the public. And I think that there's a time and place for all of it. And in terms of commonality, more and more, I would just like to say that there is an increasing emphasis on the science itself and making science increasingly interesting and losing the jargon that we need to do to present scientific evidence to support advocacy. And I really love seeing this trend of having the science first and foremost and really make it accessible and having people connect with that information. And a lot of this is shown through visuals and stories. So a lot of organizations that I have worked with have really spent a lot of time showing kind of the whole life cycle of an environmental advocacy campaign. And I think that that's another area that's really thriving so that people feel more engaged with the action that the conservation group is doing rather than just sending out a newsletter saying, we've done it, we've fixed this problem. People are able to identify the problem, be informed about it, and see the action that goes into it as the solution is met.
Yeah, and see the process more. Yeah, I agree. I feel like 5 to 10 years, even just with, it sounds silly, but even just with TikTok and increasing social media, you can see that science is becoming a lot more accessible. Like, even though there is still a lot of greenwashing and jargon out there, it's definitely is. It's really interesting to see, especially I feel like after COVID, it's just kind of ramped up, in my opinion, which is great.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that have led to this trend. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up with, Bill Nye the Science Guy, who is just, maybe the coolest person I've ever seen in my entire life. But more and more, with the introduction of online resources, especially social media and YouTube, you're able to really get a hands-on approach to these things that never used to be accessible. And that goes hand in hand with the increased education of our population. The proportion of people now receiving higher level science diplomas and master's degree is just exploding. So we just have more and more of a team to tackle these big problems that are coming our way. And you can really see, I had the opportunity to have a documentary made about my research through a grant program. And it's been a really great tool to communicate with the public about these bigger issues because, not everyone is going to read a 70-page thesis report, but people will watch a 5-minute documentary.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you kind of touched on that, like a lot of environmental communications is geared towards the younger generation, which I think is great, and I love that. Do you think there's any merit to really focusing on like the older generation, or do you think that's kind of maybe just like too far gone, or do you think just an even spread? Like what would your kind of be advice going forward for environmental advocacy organizations?
Yeah, I think environmental advocacy and environmental education is for everyone, and it needs to be for everyone if we're going to find a solution to the bigger problems. It's just a matter of having specialized communication for those groups, right? Like I mentioned a couple different forms of communication that one could take when you're reaching out to your target audience. And you just really have to be conscious of the differences in their goals and their values when you're communicating this information so that they can build a common connection with the information rather than feeling as if they're being left behind and they can't keep up with the environmental movement or they don't understand it. I think that just having a really comprehensive, multifaceted approach to advocacy and education is really the solution. We can't leave anyone behind or make people feel excluded. Science is for all and advocacy is for all.
That's true. Yeah, we have to work together if we want to figure this thing out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so moving on, in your opinion, based on where you work and all of that, what is the best way for the public to get involved and influence policy decisions in wildlife conservation?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to the last question just to kind of set this one up a bit. So I think that in terms of what environmental advocacy organizations may need to focus on or are lacking, is I think that intersectionality could be more included in a lot of campaigns. So environmental issues are intrinsically interconnected with social justice, economic inequality, and other systematic issues. And environmental advocacy organizations have come like leaps and bounds in their work to benefit these intersectional perspectives. But I think that there's always more work to be done to these relationships to ensure that environmental solutions are equitable and inclusive. And this work is just going to bring, again, more groups of people into the environmental movement and make sure that all of our solutions are going to work for everyone and are not single-handedly going down a one-way street. Also, one thing that I wanted to talk about before I talk about what individuals can do and what advocacy and work that you can do yourself is that really as environmentalists and working in the environmental sphere, I think it's really important that we do focus on going after the groups who are creating the biggest proportion of the problem. So, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, around 70% of our carbon dioxide emissions stem from just 100 companies worldwide. So this statistic really highlights that individual effort alone is not going to single-handedly solve the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And while I am a huge advocate for self-sustainability, and I think that there's so much that an individual can do, I think that making individuals feel as if the weight of the world is on their single consumer shoulders is inaccurate. So I just like to preface that before I go into the what an individual can do, because if you're listening to this podcast and you're involved in the environmental movement, I just want you to be able to give yourself that little bit of kudos. Mm-hmm. And while there's always more work to be done, there's a lot that you're already doing for yourself and making small changes.
Yeah, that's really great to touch on, because you're right. I feel like there is so much pressure even from growing up, just do this, like to reduce your footprint and all that. And yes, that's important, and do your part and try your best. But you're right, it's not the root of the issue. The root of the issue is like carbon tax and going after those big corporate companies that have the highest emissions.
Yeah, definitely. I think that as someone who has spent, her whole adult life in the environmental sphere in different capacities, that environmental guilt is very easy to experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the best way for the public to be involved in wildlife conservation and, climate action. But just being able to do these things without the guilt of feeling the need to be perfect is really important.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, that's really great to touch on.
Yeah. So I can now get to your original question, Haley.
Perfect.
Sorry about that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, that was definitely great to add. So thank you.
Yeah, to all the young environmentalists out there, progress is better than perfection. So anyway, so in terms of what I think that the public can do to get involved, I think that there's so many avenues for how the public can participate in conservation work, and there's an option that fits for everyone. So if you don't find the way that works for you, then keep looking, keep reaching out to the people that have the options available to you, and you'll find something that's best suited to you. I think that the biggest thing is just to be educated on the issues, specifically those within your community. So, like we were talking a little bit earlier, so there's short resources like short documentaries, social media, and other, online sources where you can become more familiar with the topics that are most impactful to you. I recommend looking into those close to home, but there's also a lot of information around the world in which you can get involved in as well. If you do want to be more hands-on, and you can do that in a lot of different ways, you can volunteer your yard for ecological monitoring. This is something that's done a lot in, I know for sure, Scarborough, where I did my research, and they do a lot of recording of species and ecological features within your backyard. You can also support environmental organizations monetarily, and you could also volunteer for citizen science projects. Through U of T, there's quite a few projects where you can volunteer to report on invasive species, ecological damage, or any other aspects within areas such as the ravines or, larger parks. So if you feel like you would really like to be out in nature and feel like you're making the impact, there's a lot of options available for you that I don't know if everyone knows about.
Yeah.
And then finally, and I think people hear it time and time again, but the best thing that you can do is vote. So once you're educated and you're feeling empowered about the environment, really the biggest thing you can do is fight and petition for those running for election to, satisfy those needs that you feel like you need in your community environmentally. There's a lot of resources that actually specifically focus on environmental politics. One of the resources I would recommend would be the 100 Debate Series, which is a cross-Canada program that actually brings together local officials who are running for office in smaller communities, where they only debate about online environmental issues. I did this when I was working with Wildlands League for multiple districts, and it's really interesting to see the different groups have to focus on environmental issues in that sense, and they're not allowed to switch to other topics. And you really get to be informed to the highest capacity when you're involved in projects like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I have to second that. I mean, even I remember when I could first vote at 18, it was very daunting because I was like, I wasn't too involved in politics, and I just felt like I didn't want to make the wrong decision. And there was just a lot of pressure to vote which way. And then, but it's so true. Just, try and be informed. And it's so true. It's very crucial because just the smallest thing can make that difference in the fight against climate change. So I second that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it feels like you can be disconnected from the process because you are just one person. But if you get involved and vote, then that can really, you can see the change that you want to see.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. Yeah, do you have any other advice for young aspiring environmentalists and, just the fight against climate change in general, or have you kind of said what you said?
I think that one theme that through my mentorship through the years that I always try to communicate with environmentalists is taking care of yourself is important as taking care of the planet. A lot of times, young environmentalists can feel, again, the weight of the world on their shoulders, and every decision that they make day to day can make or break big decisions. But in your fight to mitigate any environmental issue that you're pursuing, make sure that you have a sustainability plan for yourself and that you're taking care of yourself as you move through your career. The most successful environmentalists that I know are able to do their most effective work when they're taking care of themselves as well as the environment. So it's a big issue and can seem massive at times, but we're going to figure it out, and we're going to be able to, address any of the problems that you seek.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, even I had one professor in university, and she would always say after kind of a more, it was called climate change biology. That was the course she was teaching, and after
Mhm.
a heavier class, she would always say, like, just go out, go for a walk in the forest, hug a tree, do something that'll just make you feel good because we'll get through this.
Yeah, it's a heavy burden to carry, especially when you're starting out. You feel, you're learning all of these things and it's coming at you so rapid fire. But yeah, it's important to make sure that you have a sustainability plan for yourself as you go forward.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, do you have any other things you want to mention about, yeah, bees or anything?
No, I think that I covered everything that I wanted to talk about today. I think that there are lots of resources that people can have access to. People are always free to reach out to me if they would like to learn more. But otherwise, thank you for having me today.
Of course. Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for speaking with us and giving us some insight into how climate change is affecting bee populations and pollination events and everything in the environmental realm. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
No problem.
So now we're going to move on to our question of the week. So here's a question from a listener. The Ministry of Natural Resources condones aerial spraying of the Vermillion Forest in northern Ontario. How do we stop this? So I reached out to Ole Hendrickson, the chair of the Conservation Committee of Sierra Club Canada, and here's what he had to say. So herbicide spraying is ingrained in many forest management practices and can be difficult to stop at the local level. As first steps, self-education and ensuring you know exactly what points you want to bring to the public and to the individuals making decisions about spraying is the best way to assure maximum efficacy. To take action, it can be best to get in touch with the groups or individuals making this decision directly. So Mark Lockhart, who works at Vermillion Forest Management Company, would be great to get into contact with and to voice your concerns too. In their Sudbury Management Plan, it notes that aerial herbicide applications may be prescribed if competition levels from other vegetation is deemed to be significant enough to inhibit renewal success. And this is talking about if other vegetation is inhibiting renewal success of their primary species of concern, such as pines, spruces, and other conifers, then aerial application would be used. This is also important to keep in mind whilst voicing opinions. Other effective ways would be campaigning and petitioning to get the federal governments to deregister forest herbicide use. Those are some points Ole sent to me on this. We do also have some resources on the issues with spraying and the use of herbicides on our website, sierraclub.ca. One particular article you might want to check out is Why We Need a Glyphosate Ban in Forestry. You can send us a Q&A for us to answer during the next podcast at info@sierraclub.ca. A reminder also that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular new updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. The podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 93 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us.